Welcome to Notable Approvals. I am attorney Amanda Shaffer. Before I get to our case today, which I just finished, quick reminder, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you are watching so you don't miss any other lives. And if you find this video to be helpful or know someone who may, hit that share button so that other people can see this useful information as well. So like I said, I just finished my case today. If you are a regular watcher, you may know I don't normally do notable approvals at this hour, but whenever I'm fresh off a win of Asylum in immigration court, I'm pretty pumped up, pretty stoked, and want to tell everybody what happened. So today, client, it was actually two clients, are natives and citizens of the Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire. Both of them, they came separately. They were traditionally married back in the Ivory Coast, which means they had a traditional ceremony, but not on paper. They actually ended up getting married in the U.S., but they did come separately, and the wife's claim or had nothing to do with the husband's claim. So they came in 2017 with B2 visas. Both of them filed timely for asylum separately. They had their own applications. They went to their asylum interviews and they both came to hire us when their case was referred to immigration court. Now, because they both filed separate applications and didn't put each other on it, I'm not even sure what exactly when they got married, but because of that, they were given two different immigration judges and two different dates. So the first thing we had to do was file a motion to consolidate the cases. This was back in 2019. So I appeared with both of them, and the judge who had the first court date was the judge that was taking the case. And I remember that day because they told us that the next court date will be today. And this is before COVID, obviously. And it seemed like forever ago, 4 years ago, 2022, so almost 4 years ago now. And I remember telling them, like, that's just the way it is, and that is the way it is. But what amazes me about their case the most, I know that any immigration lawyers watching this will understand, their first hearing was scheduled on the notice to appear. It had the date, we had it, and then the individual hearing was scheduled for today, and it never changed. It changed judges like 3 times, but it never changed dates, and all we've been dealing with is changing of dates. So I was like, that's a good sign, that's just good karma right there. But I'm sure everyone else that's the least exciting part here. So they filed a motion to consolidate, get them into court together. Now, we're not going to talk about the wife's application. We ended up withdrawing the wife's application today. Her claim really didn't have much to it. So the husband, when he filed his claim, he was recommended to go to some guy that he was told was a lawyer. And this is, I always stress when I talk about these things, for people who go to some guy or girl or whoever to fill out their forms, sometimes they know they're not a lawyer, sometimes they don't, but you can check, and I recommend you checking. If someone tells you that they're a lawyer, you don't blindly trust them to be a lawyer. You can look it up. Like, if you just type in New York attorney search in Google, it'll bring you to a link. You just type in the person's name, and you're going to know if they're licensed in New York. And each state has a registry of licensed attorneys, and it'll also tell you if there's any disciplinary history. So this client didn't know that, and being new to the country, so he did not look up this guy and wasn't an attorney. And they didn't do a horrible job with his application, but it wasn't great. For example, he submitted the English version of his statement, but not the French version of his statement, even though he really didn't speak or read or write English. So there was like a lot of reasons why I'm sure the case wasn't approved right away. It's also a pretty confusing case. So when he came to us, we redid the application, and then we submitted this big list of evidence. That was the first submission. We had one more after that. But, we had him add to the statement. We got the translations done properly. We submitted the country conditions, all of that fun stuff. So his claim was based on political persecution. And the reason I say it's a complicated claim is that when you hear political persecution claims, you generally hear that someone's, like, just as an example, a Democrat, member of the Democratic Party, and the Republicans are persecuting them. And that's the claim. In this case, we have a person who was a member of one party, which used to be known as the RDR. It's now, I think, the RDHP or the RJR. And then he switched parties to the FPI, and that's the opposition party in his country. So he's seen as a traitor. And he did this in 2010. And the reason he switched was because he found out that his party, this was around the time when a lot of Ivorians were being registered, their births were being registered because they didn't have birth certificates. And you can't vote without a birth certificate because you can't get your voter ID. So part of his job in the party was to mobilize voters. And they would have people fill out declarations that their parents are, at least one parent's Ivorian, and then they would issue the birth certificates. He found out later on that it wasn't true that these people were Ivorian. And among other things, changes that he saw in his party, he felt that they no longer stood for democracy and equality and putting everyone on an equal playing field. In Côte d'Ivoire, they talk about reconciliation between the parties, because for those of you who don't know the history of Côte d'Ivoire, there's been a civil war going on. There was a civil war going on for a while. There's never been a peaceful transition of power from president to president. And this current president actually exceeded, he's now in his third term when he's only supposed to have 2 terms. So there's a lot going on there politically. But it is very rare that people switch parties like that. At least that's come across my desk. And, at first he did receive some verbal threats because he knew what his party did. But to be honest, there was election fraud rampant throughout the country. There's still allegedly election fraud. So that wasn't like I said, not the only reason. So in 2010, he switches parties, starts to receive verbal threats, calling him a traitor, that you're going to see what's going to happen to you, blah, blah, blah. Now, what I didn't mention was in 2002, he left the Ivory Coast, went to Benin, and actually obtained temporary refugee status. And that was because there was a revolution at the time, and he was a member then of the RDR, and the FPI was in power. And there was a lot of problems, clashing going on. But in 2004, they kind of came to an agreement that they're not going to harm one another. And all the Ivorians who went to surrounding nations were told they can come back and be safe, and they did. So he had refugee status for a couple of years, but refugee status is not a permanent status. So he switches parties, and he starts to become active in the other party. And he ended up becoming the Secretary of Communication for his section, which is a very public-facing job, so people know who you are. You mobilize people to vote, getting out the information, etc. So, and this was, again, for the FPI. Now, if you follow Ivorian politics, you may know that the former president of Côte d'Ivoire, who is the leader of this FPI party, was recently acquitted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and human rights violations, as was one of the other main leaders of an opposition party, and have since returned to the country. So he's getting verbal threats, but nothing really scary. Well, I shouldn't say that, not scary, just nothing that seemed imminent, nobody was acting on the threats. Then he starts having trouble at work because the government, pretty much ran everything. And the director of his unit was a member of the RDR party, found out who he was, demoted him twice. He complained, they threatened to fire him, and he realized, okay, I got to get a new job. So that was his first issue with the employment discrimination. Well, first issue was verbal threats, which continued throughout, and then the employment discrimination. So then he, everything is as good as it can be during this time period. But then in 2017, the most horrific thing happens, the thing that's going to change his entire life. He comes back from a meeting late at night, and he has a 16-year-old daughter at home. And he hears banging on the door, and the daughter goes and opens it, and 3 men wearing hoods with knives come in. They start beating his daughter, and they start yelling at him this is what happens to traitors, things like that. And they take him, and one of the men stay behind with the daughter. They take him to this place. I'm not going to pronounce it right, so I'm not even going to bother. But it was a place where there was known to be mass graves from the Civil War, and the Revolution, and that the person in charge that was accused of being responsible for these mass graves was the head of his new party. So they said, you're going to die here like everybody else. And they had already knocked him unconscious, actually, with a cross in the back of his head. And when he regained consciousness, and they just started beating him. They stabbed him in the hand. He still has a huge scar here. They broke both his feet, and then left him for dead in the road. And then he got very lucky that some passerby saw him lying there, picked him up, brought him to the hospital, and he woke up in the hospital. And he only knows how he got there because they told him when he woke up at the hospital. While he's at the hospital, his sister, she comes to tell him that, his daughter was raped. And she was supposed to see his daughter the night before. And when nobody picked up the phone, she drove to the house the next morning and found his daughter there. And what she didn't tell him at the time was not only was she raped, she was killed. But because he was in the hospital and in such bad shape, she didn't want him to get too upset. And it wasn't until he came out of the hospital 3 weeks later and they were making the funeral arrangements that he learned what really happened to his daughter. So just a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. So he immediately started making plans to leave. Luckily, he had worked at the airport, so he knew some of the right people and was able to get out. And his wife, his now legal wife, then traditional wife, or you could say fiance if that's easier to understand. She left a little before. They didn't want to go at the same time and have any problems. And then he came. And really, as soon as he possibly could, he went to go see a doctor. And they told him he needed foot surgery. So in January of 2018, he got surgery on both his his feet. And he actually was told recently that he needs to get another surgery because he's having problems again on his foot. Now, this case seems pretty straightforward. Now, we had a couple of issues. Number one was the fact that in the Ivory Coast, although the leader is still the same, the party in power has a different name, but it's still the same. The main people, the big honchos, the guys at the top of the government are all the same. they are feigning some type of reconciliation at the moment. The old party leader Bagbo has returned after his acquittal to the country. He met with Ouattara, who's the current president, and that was, if you look up like political situation in Ivory Coast right now, that's all you see. But then you also read a little closer, you know, you read between the lines, and you find out, well, not even between the lines, you just do a little more research and find out, well, they're actually not really sure if this is a real push to reconcile the two groups, or if this was more of a symbolic gesture. So there's really, it's hard because the government can try to push back on us and say, well, the country conditions change, so he can return now. And when we were worried about that, but so I had to go digging to find and show them, and I was able to find something called integrated country conditions, which are actually published by, I think it's the Department of State. Actually, I still have it up. It is the Department of State. Yes. So, and it showed that back in March, the U.S. was like, you know, things were okay in the midterm elections. The 2020 elections, there was violence, because that's when Ouattara decided he was going to extend to a third term in violation of the Constitution that was drafted in 2016. So in March 2022, when the U.S. Department of State released this report, they said, you know, right now Ivory Coast is at a turning point. We're at I think they called it an inflection point. It looks like it's heading towards peace and democracy and stabilization, and they have been improving economically, but they're not there yet. There's still discrimination against the opposition political parties, against certain ethnic groups. And they've talked about mission goals to go in there and to ensure that people, that the government actually is going to abide by their, or I should say, they're going. I apologize. It's 5 hours of trial. That's why I say it was a contentious trial. It's just not clear if it's actually going to be peaceful. There's been a lot of Ivorians returning to the country recently. A lot of people were pardoned who were arrested as political prisoners. But again, these are all things that they matter to an extent, because they're not actual proof of peace. They're just proof that maybe they're taking steps towards peace. So I actually didn't have to worry about that as much as I was worried about, which was nice. But I was surprised because when we started the hearing, first, the judge and the attorney for the government was like, "You're not going forward with the wife's case? Only the husband's?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Okay." So I was like, "Yeah." And then they tried to tell me there was a lot of problems with my client's case. The first problem was that of the people he was involved with. Now, like I said, there were two big heads of two of the big opposition parties who were recently acquitted by the International Criminal Court of war crimes. And they were alleged to have done some very bad things. Now, my client had nothing to do with any of that. He wasn't in the military. He literally just wanted people to vote, and get the democracy process going. So I thought we were going to have to really deal with that. But then I double checked. I knew one of them 100%, and so did the judge. And the other guy, I said to the judge, "Look, Charles Blegood, the only reason I'm not saying the name is I want him to mispronounce it, so I apologize." But I looked it up real quick, and when you type it in, the first thing you see is actually Bagbo and Blegood's trials were consolidated, and they were both acquitted together. So I told the judge that, and that became a non-issue. Then the government attorney tried to say, well, he was in Benin for 2 years as a refugee. That precludes him from asylum. And I was like, well, what? Now, we submitted the refugee document. First of all, it has an expiration date. Second of all, in the US, if you come in as a refugee, you are required a year later to file for a green card. If you don't, you lose your status and you can be deported. If you are granted asylum, you can stay an asylee your whole life. You can apply for a green card a year after, but you don't have to, although I recommend it to everyone. If you're eligible, you do it. But the point is, that's not permanent status. And then the trial attorney even cited a case. And what's nice about doing these courts virtually is when I'm in court, I'm not allowed my computer. Only the government attorney does. When I'm here, I just type in the case. I look at the summary, and it clearly says if you're a citizen and national of multiple countries, not if you're a refugee. Then you don't meet then you can go to the other country, which makes sense. And I've had that situation in a case that I'm hoping to talk about soon, that we are just waiting on background checks. Sometimes background checks take forever, especially if you're from Russia right now. So I wasn't worried about that. And the judge even said to the trial attorney, even though she kept bringing it up, like, this isn't a thing. And then they started questioning him about how his application was prepared, because we changed it because the person who filled it out was not a lawyer and didn't fill it out properly. So there was a lot of confusion with that. It took almost an hour to actually get to the questioning, which is absurd. And there really wasn't. I mean, there's 2 submissions from us and nothing from the government. So then we started going through the questions, and we felt that he should win asylum on 2 claims. Number one, on 2 bases, because there's different types of asylum. There's 2 main types, which I've talked about before: humanitarian asylum and then regular asylum. Regular asylum, you do not have to prove. You have to prove that there is a reasonable fear of future persecution. And for humanitarian asylum, the idea is that your past persecution was so bad, you should never have to return. And with regular asylum, you have past persecution as long as you prove there's a well-founded fear of future persecution. So it's a little different, a lot the same. My client's daughter, 16-year-old, was beaten in front of him, and then he later found out she was raped and killed. In the meantime, he was beaten and left unconscious, and has injuries that are still affecting him today and may very well the rest of his life. So we felt there's a really strong claim for humanitarian asylum, but that was our backup claim, because that's a little harder because he wasn't in therapy. And the first time I asked him about, does this still affect him? He does speak French mostly, not English. So I think there's a little bit of language barrier. He was like, not really. And I was like, what do you mean, not really? He had another daughter, and they actually named her Blessing, because she was a blessing, because he didn't, after what happened to his other daughter. And then he understood the question, and then he was like, oh yeah, no, I have nightmares and things like that. But we didn't have any proof. We didn't have a psychiatric evaluation, so that made that a little bit harder. But our other claim was, look, he was definitely suffered past persecution, and that means there's a presumption of a well-founded fear of future persecution. So then the burden is now on the government to say he can safely return to the Ivory Coast, because either there's a change in country conditions, which is what we were worried about, or internal relocation. Nobody argued internal relocation. There wasn't a question that there was nowhere he could go in Ivory Coast to be safe. All we were looking at was country conditions. So after, it was probably 4 hours of trial, because there was like an interruption at one point, because there was another case supposed to go on at 3:30 today, and that case got bumped. So after all of that, at the end, the judge kind of says, to a very short cross-examination by the government attorney. I always try to ask my client the questions that I know can get the client in trouble before the government attorney does, so that we can set our own narrative. So I try to anticipate all of the questions, and I basically did. She pretty much repeated the questions I asked, just a few, to see if he changed his testimony. So after that short cross, I asked him like 1 or 2 questions to clarify on the redirect, and then the judge said, all right, what's the government's position? And she goes back to this refugee thing in Benin, and the judge was like, kind of admonished her a little bit and said, if that's your objection, I already told you that that is not a valid objection. So is there something else, another reason that that the government objects to? And as soon as she said, no, we'll defer to the court, that's when I started holding back my smile, because some of the stuff isn't translated. When there's the talk between the judges and the attorneys, it's too much for the translator to be translating it while we're talking. So, my client doesn't fully know, and I don't want to start smiling until the judge actually grants it. And this whole time, my client's wife was here because she was a rider on the application, or a derivative. So if he gets granted, she gets granted. And she also had a fear of returning to the Ivory Coast. And so she was, a mess, pacing back and forth, and just kept going, are they going to ask me questions? And I'm like, you don't really know the claim. So, probably not. I was like, but you got to be here. So the judge then tells me to tell the wife to go in with the client, and they're both sitting there, and I'm here, and they're in my conference room right over there on the other computer. And she says, he's definitely suffered past persecution. The government's failed to rebut future persecution. I'm going to grant your asylum. And of course, that's when I can smile. My clients, you can see the real joy in their faces and relief. I always say this is my absolute favorite part of my job, to be with my clients when they're granted asylum. It is, it's changed their life. This is what they've been waiting for a long time, for this hearing. And I was so confident this morning, and after we practiced, and then to go into this trial today and to have it start the way it did, I was like, oh, I hope this isn't another one where all these unexpected things come up and it becomes this whole mess. And then I was worried also it wouldn't finish, because we finished at almost 5:30, which is, I've gone to 6 before at court, but a lot of judges will cut it off earlier. So I am so happy for these clients that they can rest easy now. Some of the best hugs I've gotten, in a while. Last week I got a great hug too from my client, so I don't want to discriminate on hugs. But you could tell how much your hard work has meant to these people, and that's why I do it. As exhausted as I am now, as I've been at work since 7:30 a.m., ready to crash. But it is an absolute pleasure and joy to help these people just change their life and be safe and protected, and know that they're never going to have to worry again. So in a year, they're eligible to file for their green cards. So actually you can mail it in 9 months from now. So I'm going to mark that on my calendar, and they're excited to visit Canada. I'm sorry, Canada, I'm not laughing at you. I just thought it was really cute that that's where they were like so excited to visit. They were like, can we get our refugee travel document? We want to go to Canada. I'm like, sure. So, but yes, if you have asylum, but you don't have your green card, even when you have your green card, you're not supposed to use your passport. You get a refugee travel document, which I'm happy to talk more about. If you have questions, you can always reach out. Our contact information on on Facebook and YouTube, scrolling across the bottom of your screen. On Instagram, go to our bio page. You'll find it there. Don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you're watching. hit that share button if you found this helpful or know somebody who will find it helpful. And that's really all I got for you now. I am going to go home and probably go to sleep. I got another trial coming up this week on Friday, but it's been a very good week. Our last 2 court hearings, I'm telling you, it just really it reminds me why I come in every day, why I work so hard for people that really need it. So congratulations to my clients. I don't think you're watching because you're probably driving home to go get your daughter who is at daycare. And I'm just really happy for you. So that is all for today. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.